So glad to have everybody here. We are going to learn something interesting from Masechet Chulin. Now, Masechet Chulin is generally about sacrifices and kashrut in general. And we're going to talk a little bit about kashrut today. So again, the sort of meandering subjects like Talmud in general. And today the focus is on kashrut, but Chulin is very much about other types of things. It talks about ritual slaughter. A number of weeks ago, we talked about the wrestling with Jacob the angel and the whole story about the sciatic nerve. Those laws end up becoming sort of fleshed out in Masechet Chulin. The conversation today is inspired a little bit by the conversation in the Torah this week about the Paschal offering. One of the alternative texts that we're not going to look at today that I considered was a whole conversation about whether or not festival offerings were really required. Is it offerings that were required, or perhaps really just celebratory meals? But I decided we weren't going to go down that realm. But that this part of the Torah about Paschal offerings and the rules around it, this is chapter 12 of Exodus, is very much the time where the Israelites become Israelites. They get their sense of peoplehood from the beginning here. Rashi, in the very first verse of the Torah, says, how come the Torah doesn't start with Exodus 12 when we get the first mitzvot? And the whole conversation that ultimately we get the rest, the Torah begins with Genesis so that we would get a full sense of the story. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, and the stuff today is going to be inspired by those sort of first calendrical instructions about offerings and the calendar, and the calendar begins with Passover. So that's sort of the framework in which we are sort of being inspired by in terms of where we come from in the Parsha. But today we're going to ask an interesting question that I find the answers here interesting because I didn't know that they existed, which is the question, how do we know that meat and milk are prohibited? Now, later codes codify that the prohibition comes from the verse that says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk.
Right.
And what we'll learn today is that it's not so obvious. That in fact, that discussion is broader than we imagined, and it'll be interesting to see what that is. But I'm going to begin by sharing a joke, which is not something I normally do, but I thought today would be fitting for it. And the joke goes like this. God and Moses are talking on Mount Sinai, and God is giving Moses the laws, and God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And so Moses responds, great, don't mix milk and meat. God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, because it shows up 3 times in the Torah, so this is the second time. And Moses says, okay, I have to keep separate dishes. And then God says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses responds, oh, I have to wait a certain number of hours between meat and milk. That's what that is. And God says, you know what? Do whatever the hell you want. Which is to say that the laws are very much a part of what we as humans and the rabbinic tradition have created, but also very much rooted in Torah. And so again, I find that joke just sort of by way of inspiration that this conversation is more interesting than it appears on its surface. So let's dig in. Can everybody see this okay? Thumbs up. Yes, it's big enough. Great. Okay. So we're on in Masechet Chulin on 115a, which starts on the previous English page from here, and it begins with this conversation. Now, I want to add one piece of information before we begin, which is there are actually the joke is sort of a misdirection, because there are 3 prohibitions that come from that verse ultimately, which isn't, we're going to get to it. It does show up in this text, which is consumption, cooking, and benefit. Those are the three prohibitions that we get in terms of milk and meat, that we're not allowed to consume it, we're not allowed to cook it, and we're not allowed to benefit from it. The Shulchan Aruch later on, spells this out very specifically, again, 1,000 years later. And so here we start to get this question, and it's going to begin where Reish Lakish says, Minayin levasar v'chalav she'asur. And we understand later that this is about consumption. So before we dig into it, I want to just look at the Aramaic. Can everybody see the Aramaic here? At least see it, even if you don't understand it, that's okay. So it says, Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, or said. And this is the word I want you to highlight on. If we were sitting in person, I would have you write a box around it. It's minayin. Minayin is one of those technical terms, the sort of code words of Talmud, that invites the question, from where is something derived? How do we know this is true? And the question is almost always responded to, the answer to that question is almost always a verse. So the question it's really asking is, from where in Torah do we derive this law? We see the word minayin everywhere. It's everywhere. And here we see it as well. Amar Reish Lakish minayin. From where is it derived? Levasar b'chalav, that meat and dairy, she'asur, is prohibited. And then we get this phrase, Talmud lomar. Does everybody see that? Talmud lomar right here. It's confusing because you would assume that the word Talmud here means Talmud, but it doesn't mean Talmud. Talmud lomar means sort of our learning from the verse states. It always introduces a verse. Yes, Sheila.
This raises another interesting question for me anyway. Okay, we understand Reish Lakish. By that time, obviously, there were laws of kashrut.
Correct.
Okay. Where did the laws of kashrut actually get started? I mean, Moses is not given the laws of kashrut. It says you shouldn't eat it. Some they pulled out, some they didn't pull out. I mean, all these laws, when did they actually write them down and set them up? During King David, later, when? I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So a few things happening at once. First is, let's be clear about, maybe I'll turn this off for a second. Let's be clear about terms here. When we say something is kosher or kasher, it's we don't often translate the actual word. We just say kosher. But what we mean is that it is fit to eat according to whatever rules we've set up. So something that is kosher means it's fit and appropriate for use, as opposed to something that is not kosher, which is not fit for use. The Torah describes a number of rules around consumption and other kinds of things. As far as I know, the laws are sort of enculturated. They are articulated the Torah requires a bunch of things. It says don't eat this and eat this, right? Eat certain animals but not other animals, right? Those rules get interpreted by various generations of Jews, Israelites, from the biblical period until the early rabbinic period, such that these things are in existence. They sort of accumulate over time. So I don't know that and maybe this is known, but I don't know it, if there was like a specific
Rabbi.
Kashrut. Yeah, please.
May I offer that David Kramer from JTS has a really fascinating monograph on, which I think is called Jewish Eating Through the Ages or something like that, that gives a historical account of how these rules accreted over time and when they were more restrictive and more lenient at different points in time, with an overall thesis that you can relate desire to separate Jews from others during times of stress versus mixing with others during times of acceptance or less stress, to the degree to which the rules at any given time are more lenient or more restrictive. So it's a really interesting monograph, both for the historicity and for that thesis, which I think he argues reasonably well, but you can argue against it if you want. I mean, it's a thesis.
That
Where do you
sounds
find it?
In Ohio, as far as I know, the only two libraries that have it, at least when we read it, were Ohio State and Oberlin.
Okay,
And
but what's the name of the monograph?
I think it's Jewish Eating Through the Ages. It's something like that, but it's David Kramer.
Jewish Eating and Identity Through the Ages.
Jewish Eating and Identity Through the Ages. Debbie just looked it up.
Yeah, you can find it on Amazon and other places. Certainly, because I'm seeing it on Amazon. David Kramer is one of the librarians at JTS. I've only learned from him once
The
at
head
a
of it.
conference.
He's the head librarian.
Yeah, exactly. So amazing. I'm so glad you added that. So definitely we'll bookmark that collectively as a place to go. I will say the following, which is, I think it is a part of culture, more broadly, human culture, to decide what is and isn't appropriate around eating. Every culture has some restrictions or boundaries on what we eat or how we eat it or the context in which we eat it or the way we eat it, things like that. And so it seems reasonable that Jews and Israelites would have the same. I do think that by the conversation we're about to have, the decision of whether or not we eat milk and meat is already decided, and now they're looking for evidence. Now they're looking for sources. I will point you to, there's another conversation, maybe we'll learn it one day. There's a great discussion in which Rabbi Yossi argues that poultry should not be treated as meat and that we should be able to have dairy and poultry together, which the rabbis basically say, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to leave you alone, but no one's going to do that moving forward, which is an evidence to say that things were in flux on some level, even in this period.
Well, yeah, the same thing with fish.
For certainly
Fish-
true.
For some people, they have another set of, or you just clean your food. You don't use the same
Yeah,
thing.
there's an interesting thing in the Shulchan Aruch in which fish, and again, we haven't even studied the Talmud yet, the fish, there's a concern about danger, about eating fish and other things
Oh,
together.
it's danger.
So that's in the Shulchan Aruch, and we could, I'm happy to find that another day and point you to it. Let's learn this text here, because it is an interesting conversation. I will say the following. Even if we had 60 full minutes, we probably wouldn't cover everything. So I will, before the class ends, I will put a link in the chat, or you can send me an email and I'll send you a link so that you could read the whole thing if you want to. We're really just going to get a taste. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph of Reish Lakish?
I'll read it.
Please.
Reish Lakish says, from where is it derived that meat cooked in milk is prohibited for consumption? The verse states, with regard to the Paschal offering, you shall not eat it partially roasted nor boiled in any way. As there is no need for the verse to state boiled in any way, since it could simply have stated boiled, what is the meaning when the verse states boiled in any way? It is included to tell you that there is another manner of cooking, the product of which is prohibited like this one. And which cooking is this? This is meat cooked in milk.
Okay, so let's unpack this. So the verse states, you shall not eat it partially roasted nor boiled in any way. So let's look at the Hebrew here. Al tochlu, do not eat, mimenu, from it. Na is a whole conversation unto itself. Sort of, we're going to ignore it for now. Uvashel mivushal, and sort of boiled and boiling. Now, Hebrew, because it's a root language, lots of words will have like related meanings. Often when two words are used together like this, it usually means you shall surely not do the thing. It's like really emphasis. And so here, what Reish Lakish's understanding is this doubling of vashel mivushal is to say, really, really don't boil it. Boil it in any way. And he interprets that, the extra word, she'ein Talmud lomar mivushal, that this extra word is not required. That must mean boiling refers to being in milk. And therefore,
Why?
this
I mean, we
is
use
our source
water.
for not mixing milk and meat. I'm sorry, Sheila, please.
But we use water. I mean, today, who would even, I mean, even the non-kosher people, you use water, wine, you know.
Yeah, so this is a great, if we were, this is a great place where if we were in like a Beit Midrash and we had all these hours together to really unpack it together, we would start to really dig into it. Not only that, but we can see, because I'm going to share my screen, that he is really, really twisting the verse. Here's what the verse says. Al tochlu mimenu na uvashel mivushal b'mayim. He ignores the fact that the verse itself says, don't boil it in water. So he has ignored this word, and then it says, but roasted, right?
People make chicken soup.
And then in the various parts. He is ignoring b'mayim, because, and by saying, you could have read uvashel b'mayim and don't boil it in water. He's saying mivushal, this extra verb refers to milk. So he's not necessarily fully ignoring it. He's saying it's not the only thing. So what does Rabbi Yochanan say in response? Sheila, will you read it for us?
Is that derivation that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi taught?
Sorry.
ugly?
Rabbi, yeah, it just starts with Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish
No,
Lakish.
Rabbi Yochanan
Go
said
for it.
to Reish Lakish, is that derivation that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi taught ugly, that you derive a new one? The verse states with regard to an animal's blood, you shall not eat it, you shall pour it upon the earth as water. And the next verse states, you shall not eat it, that it may go well with you and with your children after you. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi teaches that the redundant second verse is not referring to the prohibition of blood. Rather, the verse is speaking of the prohibition of meat cooked in milk, teaching that it is prohibited for consumption. Now, this is coming from Deuteronomy.
Correct.
Not from, so this is already a later addition.
Well, it's later than Exodus, but it's certainly earlier than what we're talking
And
about
the
here.
Talmud,
Let's look at Deuteronomy together. It says, Lo tochelu, tochlenu al haaretz v'tishbechenu kamayim. Right? You shouldn't eat this blood, but instead pour it in the ground like water. Do not eat it, because so that good things will happen to you and your children. And it's saying that this sort of extraness, this extra repetition, that it's going to happen over a long period of time, not just you, but for your children, that refers to boiling milk and meat. Now, I want to point out, these arguments are barely relevant. Like in the sense, not relevant, I mean to say that they are barely good arguments. These are not great arguments. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Really, really strong argument. So we have this first one in Exodus. Rabbi Yochanan turns to Reish Lakish and says, look, our rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he taught something. Is his teaching so ugly to you that you need a new one? Again, we can start to get some of these personalities, these interactions. So what does it happen? It says the following. Can I get another volunteer to read? Ron, do you feel like reading? Okay. Bill, I know that you don't like to read that much on the screen, so I'm going to read it. Do you say that the verse is speaking of the prohibition of meat cooked in milk? Or perhaps it's only referring to one of the other prohibitions in the Torah, meaning to say, this verse from Deuteronomy doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of meat and milk. Maybe it's only referring to blood, another one of the prohibitions. You say, go out and learn from the 13 hermeneutical principles, which we're going to read the note on the side about those. One of which is a matter that is derived from its context, meaning to say that we should understand laws based on where they come from. So to what are the adjacent verses referring to? They were referring to consecrated animals that were redeemed, which it does a few verses earlier, which are a combination of two types. They are non-sacred in that they may be eaten, but they are prohibited from shearing and work like consecrated animals. And we'll go back to the verse and we'll look at it. Here too, one may conclude that the verse is referring to a prohibition that involves two types of food, their prohibition of meat and milk. Again, this argument is very flimsy, so we're going to break this apart. So it's saying, is this verse really doing what you said it's going to do? Or perhaps it's referring to something else. Here's the 13 principles. From the 13 hermeneutical principles, one of which is the matter that is derived from its context. The principle, a matter that is derived from its context, dictates that the meaning of an ambiguous verse in the Torah should be derived from the adjacent passage. This principle is included in the 7 hermeneutical principles listed by Hillel the Elder, as well as Rabbi Yishmael's 13 hermeneutical principles, which are here. Now, I want to point out, if you have a Sim Shalom and you open up the beginning, inside the beginning has these 13, Rabbi Yishmael's 13 principles.
Oh, I know which ones. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the first part. So we now know, right, in this conversation, right, they're saying, go look at these principles. Are we applying them? And here we're going to say, go look, the principle we're going to use is context. I know I'm bouncing around, forgive me. So what's the context of this blood section? Eat it, however, as the gazelle and deer are eaten, impure may eat it together with the pure. And that we have this, they're talking about this category of food, of animal, gazelles and deer, that may be eaten, that are impure, but also pure. They're this complex duality. That's the reference that they're making in the verse, in the Gemara here, that says there are a combination of two types. And what is also two types? Meat and milk. That's the argument they're making.
They could just as easily have said meat and wine.
Yeah, they very easily could have. Absolutely. So this is Rabbi Yochanan's response to Reish Lakish. What does Reish Lakish say? Sheila, you've been in the voice of Reish Lakish thus far. Why don't you read what his response is?
Reish Lakish replied to Rabbi Yochanan, my exposition is still necessary, since if the source for the prohibition of eating meat cooked in milk were from that verse cited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi alone, I would say that this statement applies only to the prohibition of eating meat cooked in milk, but not to that of deriving benefit from it. The verse cited with regard to the Paschal offering teaches us that even deriving benefit is prohibited, just as it is prohibited to derive benefit from a disqualified Paschal offering.
Okay, so we know, because I said it earlier on, that there are actually 3 prohibitions with milk and meat: eating, cooking, benefiting. Right. So if I sell you, well, not you, but if I sell a cheeseburger, right, I have prohibited. I have transgressed the obligation of the prohibition of benefiting, because I've now benefited from the meat and milk because I've made money on it. Right, that's an example. So here Reish Lakish is saying the argument from Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is fine, but it doesn't say anything about benefit because it's only like the context is only about eating. The Paschal offering context is a stronger context, and therefore my argument is still necessary, because the Paschal offering also teaches us that benefiting from the Paschal offering is prohibited, and therefore so is this. Is everybody with the argument so far, even if you disagree with it? Is everybody following the steps?
Sort of.
Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill.
Anyways, the reason why poultry, where I've been told a long time ago, was included as meat is because you may get confused about meat. Okay, now when you eat a cheeseburger that's made out of cheese, that's made out of synthetic cheese, that's okay. Now, isn't that the same argument as you may get confused? Why is that allowed?
Yeah, I mean, look, I am not here to psak halacha, but there is an interesting argument to be made here about the difference between the perception of a thing and the thing itself. Right? Now, that could be outsiders' perception or it could be our perception, but either way, I think we know this in other ways as well, quantum theory as well as sort of sociology. Perception is reality on some level. And so,
Rabbi?
yeah, David.
Yeah, I building on what you just said, we've all heard, we all learned when we were kids, this idea, you know, you could mistake the chicken for veal or whatever. And we just accept it when it actually seems, if you think about it, to be complete nonsense. Who could mistake, especially in an era when you were much closer to the animal, even if you thought the piece of chicken somehow looked like veal, which it still doesn't. I mean, you go to the store, you can tell the difference. But when we were closer to animals, for sure that made no sense. And yet we all accepted it for all these years. Personally, I like the sociological idea a lot better, that if you wanted to have meat on Shabbos or Yontif, because it was a rare thing to eat, because most people up until the mid to late 19th century literally ate just about only bread most of the time. If you wanted to celebrate with meat, and you had to make chicken meat because chicken was affordable and ubiquitous, and you didn't want to kill the cow because that gave you the milk, etc. So
David?
whatever.
David, you can mix the things up. I'll never forget, they tell you don't eat outside because you don't know what you're really getting. I asked them, I was at an event, I asked them, what is this salad? They said it was tuna. It wasn't tuna. It didn't taste like tuna. And I'm sure that it was crab or something, some tray fish.
So,
Because they look
My
the
mother
same.
had a good friend when I was growing up who was allergic to turkey. And she would always say when she went out, is it really chicken salad or is it turkey salad? Because for whatever reason, way more often than you would think, it was turkey salad and not chicken salad, because the turkeys were bigger and pound per pound, I guess, less expensive than cutting up a chicken for chicken salad. So she actually would ask the question, and a lot more times than you would think, they would say, you know what, it actually is turkey. If you're allergic, we better not serve it to you.
wow. Yeah. So all of this is to say, I'll summarize this because I want to get us back to the text here. That there are layers here, right? It's not just what it looks like on paper, but that human experience is playing a role. So here in this conversation in the Talmud, we're talking about the various reasons, biblical reasons why meat and milk might be prohibited. We've now heard two of them. We're going to hear a third. The Gemara asks, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, from where does he derive that meat cooked in milk is prohibited for benefit? Remember, the rabbis are only allowed to use one verse for one thing. And if they want to prove something else, they need a verse. So Reish Lakish is saying, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's source about blood and this other, the Deuteronomy context, that's great for eating, is not a good argument for benefit. Reish Lakish's source in the Paschal offering is great for benefit and eating, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi needs another verse so that they're on equal footing. And what is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? Where does he get it from? And you can see Rabbi Beha'ana'ah with benefit Menale. Where does he get it from? The Gemara responds. Now, I want to point out here one other thing. The Gemara is responding on behalf of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi because Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is not here. So the Gemara is speaking on his behalf. It's derived from this verse from Deuteronomy. Now, I don't like this translation, and we're going to look at it on the inside. So give me 1 second to pull it up, because I don't like the translation they have here. 14:21. Nope, that's not the right thing. What do I want to put here? Oh, yeah,
And
okay.
of course, a lot of this is also people's taste and that they're
Sure.
not accounting for.
For sure. So it says the following. The Gemara responds, he derives it from here. For you are sacred, kadosh, people, sacred people, unto the Lord your God. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That seems pretty clear, right? And that's one of our three, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And is stated below, neither shall there be, and it says sodomite here, which is a very bad translation, Kadesh of the sons of Israel. And that's the one we're going to look at because it's a bad translation. Here's the verse. It says the following. Lo tihe kadesha mi benot Yisrael. No Israelite woman should be a prostitute. Velo yihe kadesh mi bnei Israel. And nor should an Israelite man be a prostitute. The translation adds all sorts of other kinds of things that's not relevant. Here, the word kadesh or kadesha, you can see from various places. Here in the BDB, Brown, Driver, and Briggs dictionary, although I think it's a lexicon, here it refers to this term, which is a prostitute. So here, it's making the argument. Again, these are sort of wild arguments. We have the argument. From here, we have this sacredness, right? Don't boil the kid's mother's milk. And we have this verse about not being prostitutes using the same word of kadosh. The similar expressions teach that just as below, prostitution is a prohibition that involves enjoyment. Again, I'm not translating as sodomy because that's not what it says. Which is to say that this is sort of sex as enjoyment and benefit. So too, if that's the case, then in the case of eating, it's also using the same language, and therefore benefit is excluded in both cases. Is everybody with this argument? Even if you, no, Sheila. So here's the argument. It uses the word kadosh or kadesh in both places. He's making the argument, or the Gemara is making the argument, that prostitution is sex for enjoyment and benefit, meaning that there's a financial exchange. And therefore, because of the word kadesh in both places, we don't boiling a kid in its mother's milk gains the quality of benefit, not just food.
Rabbi,
Yes.
couldn't I theoretically argue against that Kadesh in this sense, meaning cult prostitute, is about the idea that they thought that they could have better grain, et cetera, if they had, so to speak, sex in front of the God that would guarantee that? That made it,
Yes,
if you will, holy sex, but it was prostitution because it was outside of, let's call it the normal bounds. But ironically, for those particular religions, nevertheless, considered holy sex.
Yeah.
Obviously not to our religion, but
yes. So the JPS speaks to this, and it says in the note, the meaning of the Hebrew kadesha is uncertain. Perhaps a type of female functionary at a religious site, and then new JPS translates it as a sacred prostitute. But the notion that in ancient Near Eastern religions included prostitution as a religious act has since been discredited. And here, again, the same thing. Kadesh is uncertain, although simply the male counterpart of Kadesha, see the previous note, as it mentioned, as if it refers to a distinct category. So the answer is, I'm not sure that it's clear either way. It's very, very possible that it refers to some sort of ritualized religious sex, but the JPS seems to be begrudging to make that argument. Yeah.
So would the argument be, and I'm obviously opening to learning new things, that that we, in order to build up our own position, belittled or accused or whatever might be the right word, Canaanite religion of involving cult prostitutes, but what was actually going on might be more complicated than that and less obviously, from our perspective, sinful? I don't know, but I'm wondering.
So I am not an expert in the sexual mores of the biblical period, and so I'm hesitant to make any claim. And I mean that in a very academic sense. Like, prostitution is something that exists today and continues and has existed for thousands of years. Its relationship to society has changed over years, and so I am not aware. I'm just not knowledgeable enough to be able to point. I think the point is here in our context is that prostitution is about using sex for benefit, financial benefit.
Fair enough.
And therefore, that's where that becomes problematic here. Obviously, we see prostitutes showing up in Torah and Tanakh, right? But here it's making the argument, and I think for this to be an argument about meat and milk is honestly outrageous. But it is used here, and the reason why I brought this in this whole section, not because it's super fascinating to start with, and it pulls us in all sorts of interesting directions, but in part because the rabbis are using all of the tools available to them, right? They're using context, they're using wordplay, they're using all sorts of references, the duplication of words in our Paschal lamb sacrifice reference. They're using all sorts of different methodologies here to derive the law, which I think very clearly comes from don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And so it's really fascinating for us to start to understand, why is that the case? Why is it that they're using these sources to derive these laws? It could be, right, that they're playing games. I'm reticent to make that argument because of what Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, which is the derivation that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi taught ugly, that you should derive a new one? Meaning to say, why isn't Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi's argument good enough for you, Reish Lakish? That to me feels like it's not play, that there is something else happening here. Me personally, that's what I think.
So I would tend to agree with that, and I'll just posit, I don't know whether this is where we're going at all, and maybe we're going someplace much better than this, but maybe one reason could be that if we only said don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, then the obvious surface meaning of that is milk and meat are fine together as long as it's not literally the child of the animal in the milk of the mother.
Yeah, yes, it's very, that's why I told you the joke at the beginning, where don't boil a kid in its mother's milk is not actually all that obvious. And the joke manifests that at the beginning, which is to say, God says this 3 times, and Moses interprets it in all of these different ways. And it's not particularly clear how that works. There's a reference in the Shulchan Aruch that makes it sort of explicit, and I would point out that the rabbis later on make a distinction between you've slaughtered an animal and there's milk inside the stomach. They make the distinction between that and how to make cheese, which is used using animal stomach, and other kinds of things. All right, let's keep going. Let's see where else this takes us. Anybody want to read who hasn't read? Okay. The school of Rabbi Eliezer taught. The verse states, "You shall not eat of any animal carcass. You may give it to a stranger who is within your gates, that he may eat it, or that person may eat it. Or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a sacred people in the Lord, to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." This is the same verse as above, just he's quoting a different part of that verse. Remember, the rabbis don't quote first of all, they don't always quote the part that they're referring to. And so here we're getting 2 parts of the same verse quoted by 2 different people, but it's the same verse. The Torah stated that the prohibition of meat cooked in milk is after the halacha of animal carcasses, to teach you that when you sell a carcass to a Gentile or a non-Jew, you shall not cook it in milk and then sell it. The meat cooked in milk is prohibited for benefit and may not be sold, which is to say, the whole conversation about selling a piece of animal flesh is in the same verse as not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, that context seems to make a strong argument that you shouldn't benefit from it. So now we start to get why Rabbi Yochanan was pushing against Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish is saying the argument isn't good enough, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi has a good response. Or in this case, Rabbi Eliezer is doing it sort of on that same team. What do the other rabbis say? The school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. The Torah states 3 times. This is the one we classically know and is really the majority opinion much later. You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk, and it references the 3 verses. One verse serves to teach the prohibition of eating meat cooked in milk. One serves to teach prohibition against deriving benefit from it, and one serves to teach the prohibition against cooking meat in milk. Now, this is the one that gets codified. This is the one that's quoted in the Shulchan Aruch much later, which is to say, we've got 3 references and 3 prohibitions. It's sort of a neat package, tied in a bow. What do people think about this? Yeah.
And now there are people who keep kosher, and yet they are owners of a trade delicatessen or a restaurant. Now they have a fence around it, siyug, right?
So
That somebody else owns it.
That circumstance does show up, and reasonably shows up, by the way. And the question of how do we resolve the cooking and benefit piece of it is probably it's not mentioned here in this Gemara, but is certainly going to be a question, which is, what do I do with something like this? Can I give it away? Right? Do I sell it? Like, if I do, should I lose out on resources that I've spent money on? Rabbis are very practical people, and so I don't know the answer specifically what the halacha is about exactly how you should structure the business or whatever. But that is certainly a reasonable extension of this conversation.
Because there are a number of people I know who, they own businesses that are not kosher.
Yeah. And I imagine that the rabbis encountered it also. Like, I don't think that's a new phenomenon. I think that is probably a long-standing one. Any other thoughts on this before we move on a little bit more? Okay.
The only thing I would offer on that point, and again, it's not really satisfactory, it's more of an explanation than an excuse, is that if you think about what Kramer says in his monograph, we do seem to be living in one of those eras where mixing has been more acceptable, and therefore some people, if you will, whether allowed to or not, are per se more lenient on the one hand. And then the other hand would be, you got a business, it's your livelihood. Maybe you could have a different business with a different livelihood, but maybe other than the strictest part of the community, nobody's asking your question out loud anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, this is a conversation for another day, not necessarily within a Talmud class, but I do think we are experiencing the 20th and 21st centuries are dramatic, monumental shifts in Judaism. And we are collectively experiencing, I think, something very much akin to the destruction of the temple and the beginning of rabbinic enterprise. I mean, we're really experiencing a pretty dramatic shift in how Judaism functions, and we're living through it. And I don't think there's a clear answer. 1,000 years from now, they'll write the history about how this worked, but we don't know now. And I think in that question, that sine wave of more and less lenient, we have parts of our community that are stricter than ever, and we have parts of our communities that are more lenient than ever. And I'm not putting a judgment or a claim on the truth of either of those. And so we live in interesting times, as it were.
Rabbi, I really like that hypothesis because it helps me. I wonder to myself, why you have the phenomenon, which is scary, of disaffiliation and lack of any observance whatsoever at all, juxtaposed to some of my neighbors, for example, who it seems to me wear rose-colored glasses about what the shtetl was like, because they're trying to out-shtetl the shtetlach Jews, so to speak, in the way they dress, in the way they eat, et cetera, and so forth. And if I point out to them that my grandparents, who literally came right out of those shtetls, didn't behave the way you are, even though they considered themselves, quote, Orthodox, close quote, their jaws sort of drop. They don't answer that. They just ignore it. So
Yeah.
maybe your
Some of them are
hypothesis
ballet
helps explain
teshuva.
that.
David, some of them are ballet teshuva, and they are the ones who try
So-
to outdo.
Well, that's certainly what they call themselves. I think that's a phrase that's packed with a lot of, if you will, problems for people who don't consider what some of them are doing. Let's just say ballet tshuva. It might be ballet something, and I won't say what because I don't want to be mean.
So,
And who's to say they're wrong and I'm right? They could be right, I could be
So-
wrong, or we could both be right in different ways or wrong
So-
in different ways.
So I want to offer the following frame because I don't want to get too lost, and nobody in that community is here to sort of defend themselves. So we want to be thoughtful of that. Which is to say, the activity that we're experiencing now, studying Talmud over Zoom, and having a conversation about, milk, the sources of the halacha of milk and meat, is a manifestation of the modern engagement with our tradition. And there are lots of answers to how do we deal with being modern and also Jewish and living in tradition and in relationship to tradition. And there are a lot of good answers to that question, right? Some of them is what we're doing here. Some of them is what your shul community looks like. Some is what other shul communities look like, or other non-shul communities, as the case may be. And so I think for us, we can just hold that we live in this era of modernity, and we're trying to navigate it. And I think part of the conversation, the thing that Bill said and that you, David, said about, like, this stuff happens because we might be confused, is as much a manifestation of the kind of argument we're seeing here in the Talmud, which is that there are lots of answers that hold truths in parallel. And here I want to say simple, but it's not really simple, but here we've narrowed our conversation to, how do I know that meat and milk is prohibited and in what ways? How do we do this in the same way they're trying to say, we have this tradition, we have Torah and Tanakh, how do I hold that with the reality that I have now? That's the same conversation we're having, right? When I go to the store to buy a suit, right, or a piece of clothing, am I checking it for shatnez, right? Am I paying attention to those details as a part of holding tradition? When I invest my money and resources, am I doing so thoughtfully in terms of my values in modernity? And so I don't think we're going to learn any more of this, the text, but I think that the question that the rabbis are grappling with, which is, how do I know this is true? How do I bring evidence from tradition into my life so that I'm living it in a way, and that it's clear that there was more than one answer? I think is, I don't want to say it's exactly the same, but I do want to say it is a manifestation of the similar impulse that we have, which is we're just trying to figure it out together, and that there isn't one clear answer. Yes, Bill. Wait, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think when it comes to modernity, people are making excuses to allow things which ordinarily wouldn't not be allowed, like a Shabbos elevator, like things along the same way. I mean, how can you walk up like a 20-story building if without a Shabbos elevator? It's not practical. So,
I think that's a beautiful example, Bill, because I think in this respect, this is exactly what, and you can correct me, Rabbi Markiz, if I'm wrong, but exactly what you were trying to say. I think we could, for example, study something about an eruv in the same way we're studying this, and think about, for the rabbis, that must have been relatively easy, even though it was maybe demonstrably hard looking at the arguments, because they lived in small places that didn't have multiple stories and didn't have super highways crossing the eruv. So you have to decide, can the eruv cross the super highway or not? And I remember studying with another rabbi the phenomenon that the way he put it was, if you want to walk, and I'm putting it in Cleveland terms, Rabbi, but if we were going to put it in DC terms, maybe we'd say from DC to Germantown or something like that. But if you want to walk from Beechwood to Mentor on Shabbos, you won't make it. But it's one contiguous urban area, so there's no problem with trying. And that probably would blow the rabbis away because they just didn't have urban areas that big.
yeah, my brother, my nephew lives in Florida, and the Chabad down there will take scooters to Temple. At first, they frowned upon it, and then one
You're
person
kidding.
started doing it, and then another person, not motorized scooters, but ones that you got to push. And that would, or you'd think that would not be allowed on Shabbos, but then
It's
one person
Chabad.
did it. What?
It's Chabad. Chabad is much more lenient. They make adjustments.
I probably would permit it too, personally. I would permit a bicycle, but I think all of this is, I want to say that we have this, because we're humans, and a sense of history in large numbers is hard for our brains to really calculate. And we want to imagine that the ancient world, or 1800 years ago, was dramatically different than our own, and that people were dramatically different. But the truth is that they weren't that different. They asked the same questions. They struggled with the same problems. If you move to a new town and you're Jewish, right? You're moving from Surah to Pumbedita to Baghdad to whatever, right? In a different text I was learning, the rabbi was legitimately from Baghdad. You might ask the question, how did they decide where to live, right? How close to the community did they live? Do they live far away? What boundaries are they willing to cross? And so I think what's important to remember, and again, we were sort of in the context of meat and dairy, but I think we can ask ourselves those bigger questions, which is to say, they were asking the same kinds of questions as us. They might have different answers, they might have slightly different context, but I don't think those are the wrong questions. I think those are the right questions, which is, how do we live in honor, respect, and tradition, while also living lives of relative modernity? Whether it was 1800 years ago modernity, it was our modernity, the responses might be different. But
Right.
I think the questions of Shabbos elevators, or whether or not to use, human-powered vehicles, right, bicycles and scooters and what have you, or the question of the fact that Los Angeles is halachically a walled city because of the freeways. It's not from Yoshua ben Nun, so you still read the Megillah on the right day, but on the non-walled days. But
Is that true? Is that true
yes.
that
It's a halachically walled city because they use the freeways as the eruv. My point being, they still read the Megillah on the day as everybody else. They're not like a walled city halachically in that way, but
Because it wasn't walled, it didn't even exist back then.
right, it wasn't walled then. Those are all, to me, that's the beauty of Judaism. I mean, Bill, you framed it in negative terms, and you should feel how you feel. But to me, that's the beauty, which is that we live in this era, this creative era, where we can say we are not abandoning the world we live in, but we are living in it Jewishly.
I have to say that while we're having this love fest of agreement, because I couldn't agree with you more, I'll just add in that I sometimes speculate to myself, especially when studying Talmud, if the rabbis were living now, whether they would come up with the same answer. And even if they came up with the same answer, how would they get to it? What would the argument look like? Because I agree with you. We're pretty much the same human beings as they were. It's not like evolution happened so fast that we're somehow more, quote, evolved, where we really aren't.
We really
At the same time, though, I really do like the idea, and I've sometimes even asked the question, what kind of God do you think God is? When you say, it's one thing to say we respect the tradition. We want to grapple with those who came before us, and we definitely want to respect them. So you don't just change for the sake of change. But we also, as Rabbi Latovsky says, have minds ourselves, and those minds aren't, so to speak, so much more distant from the giving of Torah that we're somehow lesser human beings for it. I don't think that's the way the world works. And if some of my friends do think that's the way the world works because it helps their worldview, well, okay then. But if I respect them, I'd like them to respect me, and that doesn't always happen. So
community relations is certainly hard. I'm going to add one more layer to this, and then we're going to call it a day, which is we're also studying Talmud. Talmud is a patriarchal document written by men, predominantly for men, which means that we are missing at least 50%, right, of worldview that is required to live a full and whole Jewish life. And so we should take these texts with grains of salt, because they are inherently limited, not just by time, not just by technology, but also in terms of what experiences are being shown, which experiences are being presented to us. Now, we do certainly have occasional female
like Gloria
characters and stuff, but like for the most part, it's not. And so all the more so, it's incumbent on us as modern Jews to challenge our own preconceived notions and really say to ourselves, what traditions are we holding on to? Which ones do we need to retain? Which ones don't we want to retain? Which ones do we need to challenge? Which ones do we need to hold tightly because they are so dear to us? I'm not suggesting that it should be all or nothing. It certainly isn't. But there is so much that we have and that we don't have in terms of tradition. Yes, Sheila, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're gonna go.
This is a rabbi. One of the Rabbi Soloveitchiks was talking here in Cleveland years and years ago, and he said, I don't know, the question of, I think, blood and eggs came up or something. He said, forget the Talmud, forget the Shulchan Aruch. You ask the Rebbitzin. The Rebbitzin is the one. In other words, the rabbi deferred questions over the kitchen to the Rebbitzin, who was, of course, much more practical about how to use it.
I will share that Rabbi Elliot Dorff writes the Passover Guide, and I've heard him share a related and similar story of his own experience. And I think there is real wisdom from gathering Torah from many sources, and I use Torah expansively here. With that, we're going to end our learning today. Thank you.